I'll call this hearing to order, and I want to thank all of you for being here. Today's hearing is going to focus on the ever-evolving and increasingly vital missions the men and women of the U.S. Coast Guard face on a daily basis. They are the premier lifeline when our borders are lost, when our ports need securing, our coastal borders need protecting, and when many other essential needs arise. When it comes to addressing the flow of migrants, my home state of Florida continues to be the state that needs the most resources. The Coast Guard has dealt admirably with a continued increase in Cuban migrants attempting to make it to our shores. Because of the repression in Cuba, it's no wonder that so many Cubans are boarding makeshift rafts in the middle of the night to seek a better life. In fact, as what I believe is a direct result of the flawed policy changes towards Cuba, we've seen a 196% increase in migrant interdictions from the first quarter of 2014 to the same period in 2016. And it's usually the Coast Guard that first encounters and often rescues those who have fled. What is staggering is the lengths these migrants will go to evade capture or forced transport to a U.S. hospital. Incidents aboard Coast Guard vessels have included stabbing themselves with knives, swallowing hazardous materials such as fuel and bleach, self-inflicted gunshot wounds, and attempting to flee, often by jumping overboard in the middle of the sea. It was recently reported that a migrant attempted to light a Molotov cocktail during an interdiction last summer. It is these acts and the increase in violent and non-compliant behavior that put the men and women of our Coast Guard in additional danger. As the Admiral states in his written testimony, it is this capable and talented workforce that is the Coast Guard's greatest strength. And it is they who are best equipped to handle this extreme behavior. Once migrants are first detected, the job of the Coast Guard has just begun. This is evidenced by the May 20th instance, where 19 Cuban migrants climbed a lighthouse structure in the Florida Keys. While the Coast Guard was able to talk the migrants off the structure, the next day, 2 more migrants were found on the lighthouse. It was determined that they had hidden during the previous day's interdiction. It was then reported that another individual from the same group was clinging to a piece of driftwood 4 miles from Sugarloaf Key. In total, 24 migrants await a decision on their fate from the courts aboard Cutter Diligence. Today marks 26 days the migrants have been under the care of the U.S. Coast Guard, with a decision from the judge not expected for another 2 to 3 weeks. We must remember that although the mission is to intercept and ensure safety of life, unfortunately, scores of migrants who attempt to make the dangerous journey across the Florida Straits are not successful and succumb to the elements or they drown. I was fortunate enough recently to spend the day with the Coast Guard in Florida. I was briefed aboard the fast response cutter Margaret Norville on the protocols for interdicting and processing migrants. Every person brought on board is given medical treatment, food, water, shelter, clothing. They're also provided access to U.S. citizenship and immigration services, where it's determined whether or not they qualify for asylum. If it's determined that they do not qualify, it can be days or weeks before the migrants are repatriated to Cuba. Migrant interdiction is not the only mission vital to ensuring the waters and well-being of the American people. As the lead federal agency in charge of maritime drug interdictions, the Coast Guard is increasingly responsible for stopping the flow of illicit drugs into the United States. This year alone, the Coast Guard has seized approximately 290,000 pounds of cocaine, more than 41,000 pounds of marijuana. They've arrested 413 smugglers. They've seized 119 vessels. The drug rings that propel the illicit trades have vast resources to move narcotics into this country. And these organizations are using advanced methods of smuggling, as evidenced by the Coast Guard's recent intercept of 2 self-propelled semi-submersibles in the Pacific Ocean within the last year. These efforts prevented, by the way, 28 metric tons of cocaine from reaching our communities. Search and rescue missions are always represent a vital task of the Coast Guard. One only needs to turn on the news on many days in my home state to know that this is an apt description, that their motto, Semper Paratus, means always ready. In 2015 alone, the Coast Guard performed over 3,100 search and rescue missions off the coast of Florida. It's the Coast Guard that quickly responded and did everything they could do to find Perry Cohen and Austin Stephanus, 2 teenage boys sadly lost at sea last summer. Just last week, the Coast Guard sector in St. Petersburg was able to locate and rescue 5 people aboard a disabled boat 60 miles off the Gulf Coast of Mexico. And lastly, I would be remiss not to recognize the Coast Guard's valiant efforts in searching for the 33 souls who lost their lives aboard the El Faro last October. Hurricane winds would not stop them from seeking the cargo ship that ultimately succumbed to Hurricane Joaquin. These are just a few of many examples that show how much we rely on men and women of the Coast Guard to quickly respond when we need them the most. In closing, Florida has an incredibly high rate of boating accidents. In 2015, there were 55 fatalities, 737 accidents. I know we can do better, and education is the key to accomplishing that. We recently observed National Safe Boating Week, and I urge everyone to follow the tenets of responsible boating. I would note that the Coast Guard has provided a mobile app for boating safety, where you can find state boating information, a safety checklist, navigation rules, the ability to report a hazard or pollution, request emergency assistance, and other important features. Admiral, I'm pleased you're here to address all of these important topics, and I now turn over to the ranking member today, Senator Cantwell.
Thank you. And Admiral, you'll be pleased to know we're probably done with our icebreaker questions, the naval, because we're going to talk about Florida now. And if we need icebreakers down there, we got big problems. But I want to talk about the Cuban migrant issue and just the massive surge, and in particular the kind of level of aggressiveness that we're seeing from migrants that have been intercepted. As I said in my opening statement, when I visited the facility in Miami and got to go out and be with these folks for a few hours, I was hearing stories of migrants that were stabbing themselves, swallowing lug nuts, drinking bleach, anything that would require them to be brought on shore to go to the hospital. And so obviously I'm not asking you to opine on policies, but in terms of whether they're good or bad ideas, but I am asking you to opine on the impact that our current migratory policies towards Cuba are having on the psychology and behavior of migrants who are trying to come, in essence, both wet foot, dry foot, which incentivizes people to touch dry land, and ultimately the Cuban Adjustment Act in and of itself, which says if they arrive, they get to stay, is a contributor. And I was just hoping you could comment a little bit about the current state of affairs, how the numbers have ticked up over the last couple of years, what are current trends and conditions with regards to migration from Cuba.
Yeah, Senator, Chairman, the numbers you alluded to in your opening statement, the increase from 14 to 15 and now 15 to 16. From 15 to 16 this last quarter, we're up 44%. So yes, the numbers are increasing. The acts of desperation, we have not seen the likes of this before. I was involved in the Mariel boat lift. I was the commanding officer of a patrol boat back in 1980. Much different dynamics in this, what we're seeing today. We're seeing repeat attempts of Cuban nationals trying to gain entry into the United States. It's not uncommon when we have an interdiction at sea. As we start the screening process, it's not the first time for these individuals. They will go back and look for passage a second, third, fourth, fifth, as many times as it takes. And then you see these acts of desperation, self-inflicted gunshot wounds, swallowing bleach, stabbings, and the like. And we're seeing a more frequent occurrence of non-compliant behavior when our vessels come alongside. And so it is a desperate situation. At the same time, it's a huge investment for the United States Coast Guard to provide that deterrent level. And there's been discussions of, well, could we move the Coast Guard to, say, the Mediterranean Sea to deal with the refugee crisis over there? Well, there's a huge opportunity cost if you do so. We do have a maritime migrant challenge here in the United States. And if the United States Coast Guard is not there, then it's now a free pass. I wouldn't speculate that you would see a scale of Mariel, but certainly if the word is out that the Coast Guard is no longer standing the watch, I think the flow would then be unimpeded going forward. So it's imperative that we have that level of persistent presence. What I'm especially proud of is the restraint that our people show when they encounter non-compliant activity, and we do everything we can to uphold human rights concerns for these folks that quite honestly are looking for a better way of life.
There was a media report that some of the migrants that had reached the lighthouse actually came with a cell phone and ready to call local media and alert them to this. Is that accurate?
I'm not sure about the call, but they're on the American Shoal Light. 22. 2 were recovered in the water. 22 were on the light. And now, as you alluded to, the judge has implemented an injunction to discern whether that is feet dry if you land on American Shoal Light at sea. Those 22 members have been on a Coast Guard cutter for the last 26 days, and in all likelihood they may be on there for another 2 or 3 weeks longer. It is a burden to our people. At the same time, we don't have all the accommodations to provide for these individuals that are waiting to determine the outcome of their status.
Can I just ask, as long as the migrants are on that cutter, is that cutter unable to conduct other operations?
We do. We routinely operate sometimes with as many as 200 migrants on our flight decks. But it certainly does limit your operations, and those ships cannot stay out for sea indefinitely, which means you may have to cross-deck them to another ship. And every time you cross-deck someone from one ship to another, there's always the risk of someone may fall over the side.
Given that the current numbers are clearly straining your resources and perhaps diverting from the ability to do some other parts of your mission, if these numbers continue to increase, if there's a dramatic, let's say, doubling of the current numbers, is it your opinion that that point will deeply impact the ability of the Coast Guard to conduct other essential missions outside of migrant intercept?
No, Chairman, as we routinely do when we're overwhelmed in one mission area, we pull from another one. The one we would have to pull from, though, quite frankly, would be the level of effort we're doing in the transit zone in the Eastern Pacific and
in the drug interdiction.
Exactly.
So if this Cuban migrant issue gets much larger than what it is now, if it continues to grow in its trends, it is your testimony here today that you will have to pull resources from drug interdiction to deal with the migratory crisis.
We haven't reached that threshold yet, and under our operation called Vigilant Sentry, when we start seeing increased threat flows, there's also the possibility we could look for other assistance through our Department of Defense. We've implemented that in the past, so that would be another possibility as well.
Okay. I know that the recapitalization of the fleet has been identified as a priority, as a key to the long-term success of the agency. Has the current state and age of the fleet, can you talk, Conman, a little bit about what impact it's had on your ability to combat criminal networks?
Our 210-foot medium endurance cutters, one of those last night, the Coast Guard cutter Vigorous, is in the Eastern Pacific. She's home ported on the East Coast, but she went through the Panama Canal and she seized 600 kilos of cocaine last night, launching 2 boats, an armed helicopter, all at night, with a crew of 75. That's a 50-year-old ship. By the time we recapitalize those ships, they will be approaching their 55 year of service. So it is a challenge for us. We cannot do another service life extension program on our 210-foot class of ships. We may have to extend the service life out on our 13, 270-foot medium endurance cutters. I would much rather see us recapitalize those rather than trying to extend the service life to 50 years and beyond. I attribute the years of service that we get out of the ships to the men and women who do the day-to-day maintenance on them. As busy as these crews are when they're out at sea, the tempo picks up when you return to port. You would think it would be the complete opposite. They've got to get that ship maintained and ready to go to put out to sea again. They deploy 185 days out of the year, but there's not time to take a day off. And so my concern is we've been operating at this operational tempo on the backs of our people.
In terms of technological advancement, is the Coast Guard developing or fielding unmanned aircraft which can be launched from ships and used to assist interdiction efforts?
We do have that in the President's budget, and we are moving out on what I would call small unmanned aerial systems, much more portable. We worked with the Navy, and we worked closely on the Fire Scout program and did a prototype with that. But we recognize that we still need manned platforms as well to do aviation use of force, precision fire against fleeing go-fast, or launching rescue swimmers to rescue mariners in distress. You can't do that with a UAS. And so we need a light system, a system that doesn't come with a support tail of 15, 16 people like the Fire Scout did, which then I have to put other people ashore to support what is supposedly unmanned, but it comes with a very heavy manpower tail associated with it. So that's why we're looking at small unmanned systems that are sea-based, that expend our domain awareness to and just over the horizon using these more affordable and in some cases almost expendable systems.
And finally, is there a Department of Defense or Department of Homeland Security requirement for a minimum number of ships forward deployed to conduct interdiction missions for SOUTHCOM and Joint Interagency Task Force South? And if there is such a minimum number, how often do we fall short of that requirement?
I'll have to back brief you on that, Senator, but we do work through the joint staff in terms of resourcing. And as you can imagine, if you look at all the demands placed on our Department of Defense today, every combatant commander does not get the resources they need to carry out their mission. The Navy is not able to meet its requirements in the Western Hemisphere because of the demands placed in the Mediterranean, in the Mideast, and in the Pacific theaters as well, which is why the Coast Guard has doubled our effort to fill the void left by the United States Navy. I'll just add, we do a lot of work with our allies, with the Canadians, with the French, Dutch, Her Majesty's Navy, the Royal Kingdom. So they're providing, augmenting us significantly. In fact, at one point this past spring, we had 14 ships. Out of those, only 7 of those were U.S. flagged. The others were allies helping us in this Western Hemisphere of ours.
Well, Admiral, I want to thank you for your service to our country, for being here today. As you saw from the attendance during a busy day, there's a lot of interest in the mission that you conduct. I have tremendous respect for the work that you and your men and women do on behalf of our country. The hearing record is going to remain open for 2 weeks, and during this time, senators will be asked to submit any questions they might have for the record. If you receive any, Admiral, I would ask respectfully that you submit your written answers to the committee as soon as you possibly can, given all the other work you have going on. So don't divert resources away from drug interdiction to answer our questions. So, but we most certainly would want to have answers at some point if you do receive any written inquiries. And again, I thank you for appearing before us. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you, Chairman.